All right.
Here we go.
So here we are again. Long time till
Yes.
our last presentation. Um, we're closing to the end of this presentation about why Passover, occurs in different days. Uh, so we did two so far. We went through Exodus and Moses, then Joshua, and now we're on Yahusha's last days. And when was that last Passover? So this is, if I remember correctly from our previous discussion that we had, that will be three parts, the whole. So the first part will be about the Last Supper, and then two more parts the for his crucifixion and his resurrection.
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
There'll be at least two more parts, and they're long. They're pretty
that's
long.
okay.
But we're doing some editing on them right now because we haven't looked at them for a while. And there's always editing, it never stops. So, yeah, probably in about 2 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. All
Yeah.
right. Plenty of time for people to go over the Last Supper. I know it's a super important presentation, the Last Supper.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yes, it is.
And lots of controversy
Yes.
over when the Last Supper was. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yes, and like what we talked about with you one of those other times about the capital P and the lowercase p, uh,
Mhm.
Passover is known as a preparation day. So preparation day is not always on a Friday. So the
Yeah.
preparation in the Passover is a preparation day for the unleavened bread festival that's coming the next day. And I don't think that comes up too much in this, but I did want to say a couple of other things. And first of all, everyone, Maria is going to help us teach 3 slides, which is going to be really fun.
Mhm.
There are italicized words in these gospel scriptures, and we need to pay attention to those italicized words because it's going to have a huge impact on what is happening. Also, there are words that are capitalized. And when you capitalize a word, it changes it from a common noun to a proper noun. So we're going to pay attention to that. We're going to look at several different Bible versions. And we don't often do this, add commentators from other theologians, but we're going to add some of those comments in today just to kind of round off the study. And like we already said, there is another part to this study. It's the bread of the Last Supper. And we've already determined in that the Last Supper was not a Passover meal just because of the bread. So people can look at that as well. So with that, I think we're pretty much ready to start. We have quite a few slides to go through, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So I'm going to bring up this PowerPoint, and Tim and Kim are helping me as well. So this is part 2 of the Last Supper, and it's talking about, is it going to be Abib 13 or Abib 14? And it's always a controversial date because some people believe that this Last Supper was on Abib 14. And like we already have mentioned in part 1, we actually talked about what type of bread, because there was 2 kinds of bread at the Last Supper table. There was leavened bread, this beautiful leavened bread, and there was unleavened bread. But only one type of bread can represent Yahusha's body. And in part 2, this is about the controversy, and it is a controversy over the date of the Last Supper. Was it Abib 13? Was it Abib 14? And always that question, was the Last Supper actually the Passover meal? And today we're going to be talking about the day of the Passover, which day of the week it was, and of course the date of the month. This is controversy between Abib 13 question mark, Abib 14 question mark. And because there was leavened bread present on the evening of that Last Supper, we already have gone over that in the other part, that alone disqualifies this supper as a Passover meal to be eaten on the 14th. However, that is only one witness. And we want to look at John 13:1. And I think that we've mentioned before that John is a really important gospel. Sometimes Matthew, Mark, and Luke just don't quite have all the details, but John usually has the answer. So John 13:1 should settle the question. Let's just read it. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Yahusha knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father. Verse 1 plainly states that the timing was before the feast of the Passover, which always happens to be on the 14th day of the first biblical month. So logic demands the betrayal of Yahusha must occur before his sacrifice on the tree. And then verse 2, John is the only one that records this, and supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him, and supper being ended. John shows that the Last Supper took place on the very same night that Judas Iscariot betrayed Yahusha. So if that isn't the 13th day of the month, then when is it? What is actually happening? We're going to be coming back to these questions, what day and what date. So we also want to note that this study is being given according to a dawn day start, not according to sunset. It doesn't work with sunset. Why does it matter when the Last Supper was celebrated as compared to Passover? Abib 13, was that on a third cycle, a Tuesday? Or was it Abib 14, which would be a fourth cycle or a Wednesday? Or maybe it's neither one. Maybe neither one. We'll have to find out. It's really important what the day and the date is. There will be 3 more witnesses. We're going to look at John. The first one, we're going to look at John in chapters 13, 18, and 19. The second witness is going to be dealing with a phrase, with desire, I have desired. That phrase is kind of complicated for some people. And then part number 3 is a special meal. We're going to look at something special about that. But before we start anything, we want to look at Daniel 9:27, and then we will take a review of the Synoptic Gospels.
So what is the controversy for part 1? And we'll take note that if the type of bread could have settled the whole controversy of whether the Last Supper was on either Abib 13 or Abib 14 or Tuesday or Wednesday or maybe even a Thursday, then our study would be done, as there was leavened bread present. However, there are other questions that we need to consider. For example, does the day commence with sunset? Does the day commence with the dawn light? And here's one. Is the Passover meal ever to be eaten 21 hours in advance of the Passover sacrifice? And the argument is this. If the Passover meal is eaten before the Passover sacrifice takes place, then how does that align with the Torah instructions that we are given in Exodus 12? And it seems to be that there are conflicting opinions. So what do you think about these different opinions? Consider this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the Last Supper was eaten on the last night of Yahusha's life. Would you give that a thumbs up? How about most tend to believe that Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the Last Supper is the same as the Passover meal. So is that a thumbs up, or would you give that a thumbs down? That it was not the same, or was it the same? And think about what John has to say. John shows clearly that this Last Supper occurred before the Passover feast. So is there a way that we can reconcile these differing opinions? So let's consider some facts first. We know that the gospel writers would have followed Torah. And here's in Exodus 12:6. The Passover lambs were to be killed between the evenings on Abib 14. And the Jews have traditionally interpreted between the evenings to mean in the afternoon. Now, at this time, at the time of Yahusha, the priests sacrificed the Passover lambs in the afternoon of Abib 14. We can see what Josephus has to say in the Wars of the Jews. He records many Passover lambs were slaughtered from the 9th hour till the 11th hour, that hour being reckoned according to the dawn day. And note that on the Roman clock today, that would be from about 3 to 5 p.m. So let's take a look here at Josephus' historical account written in the Wars of the Jews in Book 6. And it says, "So these high priests, upon the coming of their feast, which is called the Passover, when they slay their sacrifices, from the 9th hour to the 11th, note the Roman time of 3 to 5, but so that a company not less than 10 belong to every sacrifice. And many of us are 20 in a company, found this number of sacrifices was 256,500. Take note of that amount, which upon the allowance of no more than 10 that feast together amounts to 2,700,200 persons that were pure and holy." That is a lot of sacrifices in a 2-hour period. But let's compare this quote to the prophecy given in Daniel 9:27.
Yes, Daniel 9:27 is a very interesting verse. It says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. In the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease." So now don't forget that this chart is according to a dawn day start. We just have the first, second, and third cycle. I've brought in this fourth cycle, just enlarged it a little bit. Dawn begins the light season here on the midst of the week, a fourth cycle or a Wednesday. This copper bar is the Erev, the evening after the sunset. And then after the night season, you have another dawn that would start your fifth cycle. Anyway, the midst of the week is right there at the Erev of the fourth cycle. It is always the midst of the week. And we want to keep that information in mind as we consider all of this information in the Gospels. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. In the midst of the week is when he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. In the very midst of the week. If we all remember at the crucifixion, it was at the 6th hour when Yahushua was there impaled on the tree. It was the 6th hour when it became dark. The sacrifices then, Josephus said, were completed by the 11th hour. But remember, the 6th hour to the 9th hour, or noon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Roman time, it was dark. And then at the 11th hour, just before it became sunset, is when the sacrifices were supposed to cease. This is all according to a dawn day start. Then the 12th hour would bring in the Erev. This Erev is the 12th hour from dawn, and it's still on the fourth cycle, this being the exact midst of the week. This 12th hour also fulfills the Daniel 9:27 prophecy. Then you have the night season, and when the dawn comes, that ushers in the unleavened bread festival for the first day of unleavened bread festival. Tim?
Husha, divine corpse fulfillment, pretty strong words, but let's look at it. Daniel 9:27. "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease." So there we see the exact midst of the week, as Charlene just explained to us. It is right at the point where the Erev mixture comes into position. At the moment of sunset, that would be the 12th hour, the sacrifice of Yahusha terminated, and along with it, the blood sacrifices of the sacrificial system of the Aharonic priesthood were no longer valid for eternity. The preparation fulfillment requirements. Yes, there are requirements that had to be fulfilled perfectly by Yahusha. When we read in the scriptures, we look at this day when he was put on the tree. That was the 3rd hour counted from dawn. When we go a little further, we look at when the darkness came over the land. That was at the 6th hour counted from dawn. When the darkness went away, when Yahusha released his last breath and he said, "It has been accomplished," that was at the 9th hour from dawn. We read these hours all counted from dawn. Then we have a look here. You'll see the gold bar and the orange rectangle there. That's the 12th hour. This 12th hour is the exact midst of the week. It's the 12th hour from dawn. So let's have a general consensus here, or a conclusion, I guess we could say. At 3 p.m., Yahusha's life expired. At sunset, all sacrifices were terminated forever. That's prophesied in Daniel 9:27 with the midst of the week. From 3 p.m. to Erev, Yahusha was still a divine corpse in waiting. After sunset, Yosef requested and removed Yahusha's body from the tree for burial preparations on the preparation of the Pesach night season. That was in John 19:14. His waiting, that would be Yahusha, his waiting required the burial preparation process to fulfill the strict statutes pertaining to the Passover lamb, and also, very importantly, the statutes that pertain to the red heifer sacrifice, and that all had to be done by dawn. Yahusha fulfilled those impeccably. He said, "It has been accomplished." So we're going to be starting or charting the sunset day start here again, just to make sure we have this clear. If the day commences at sunset, note that sunset, we're going to be looking at this. What marks the exact midst of the week? Is it different than if the day starts at dawn? Can this option for the midst of the week hour fulfill the Daniel 9:27 prophecy and align with the quote from Josephus? And what about the example of Yahusha standing on the pavement at Golgotha, waiting to be sentenced? Can it align with that? So we're going to count out the 3.5 days again. And yeah, this is a bit of a tricky question. We need to pay attention. And again, the dark and the dark blue and the yellow is 1 24-hour period. So we're starting on the first cycle. You see there between the two brown pillars. There's your first cycle, your first day. Then we go to the second cycle. That is your second 24 hours. And the third cycle, your third 24 hours, we have 1/2 day to go. Please look at where the half day ends. You have 12 hours of night and it stops at dawn. There's 3.5 days at dawn. 3.5 days marks the fourth cycle of the week as the middle hour of the week at dawn. So the question is this aligning with Yahusha's example? Wasn't Yahusha still very much alive and standing on the pavement at Golgotha waiting to be sentenced by Pilate? How is it that this is a fulfillment of the 3.5 days? The dawn of the fourth cycle as the midst of the week is not when the sacrifices and oblations ceased. Sunset cannot find alignment with the scriptures. A sunset day start will not align with Daniel 9:27.
So now we're going to take a look at the four Gospels. And out of the four Gospels, surely we should be able to find the date for the Last Supper. Remember our question, is the Last Supper the same as the Passover meal? And you're going to see some statements here. Which statement below is true? I want you to notice capital letters and lowercase letters. The Passover meal is known as the capital F feast of unleavened bread, a capital U and a capital B. The Passover meal is known as the feast of unleavened bread because of the command to eat unleavened bread at the evening meal on the 14th. Or how about our second statement? Is this true? The Passover meal is known as a feast of unleavened bread, lowercase, because of the command to eat unleavened bread at that evening meal on the 14th. So now we're going to examine the Synoptic Gospel account.
We're going to be looking at a lot of verses. We'll be looking at them more than once. So right now we're just going to read them and get a feel for what is actually written. This is from the New King James. Matthew 26, 17 to 21. Now on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahushua, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand, and I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Yahushua had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. And then next, you're going to see events for the Last Supper in all three of these synoptic Gospels. Now, when the even was come, and he sat down with the 12, and as they did eat, he said, "Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me." So what about understanding Matthew 26, 17? When the italicized words are removed, guess what? The verse is going to read a little differently. Let's try that. Now on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahushua, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Did you notice that Passover was indeed the first day that unleavened bread was eaten? But Passover is not the first feast day of unleavened bread. Notice those capital letters, because they change it from a common noun to a proper noun. In the New King James Version, Matthew says it was the first of the unleavened bread, capital U and a capital B. Sounds like the unleavened bread festival. Is that really when Yahushua held this Last Supper? On the surface, this appears to contradict John's account, which plainly states that the Last Supper occurred before the feast of the Passover. Let's look at Mark 14.
Mark 14, 12 through 18. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, italicized, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" And he sent out 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. Wherever he goes in, say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' Then he will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared. There make ready for us." So his disciples went out and came into the city and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. And next we have some events for the Last Supper. And in the evening he cometh with the 12. And as they sat and did eat, Yahusha said, Verily I say unto you, one of you which eateth with me shall betray me. So this sounds like we have the same challenge here as we did in Matthew.
Luke 22, 7-16. Then come the day of unleavened bread. Note the lowercase letters, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat. So they said to him, Where do you want us to prepare? And he said to them, Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, The teacher says to you, Where is the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large furnished upper room. There make ready. So they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Next, Luke records the events for the Last Supper, verse 14. And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. And he said unto them, With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. With desire he had passion in his voice. For I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof, until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of Yahuwah. Is Luke just as challenging as Mark?
Well, now that we've taken a look at what Matthew, Mark, and Luke said, we're going to take a closer look in the New King James. The context is still, we're going to say it is Abib 13. Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? What day was it and what date? Let's look at Matthew 26:17. We're going to zero in now. Now, on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahusha. Note the capital letters. Note what they're saying to you as proper nouns. In Mark 14:12, now on the first day of unleavened bread, with capital U and a capital B. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, Did they really kill the Passover lamb on the first day of unleavened bread? In Luke 22:7, this is the New King James Version, remember that. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. Does it not seem that there is a lot of emphasis on the feast of unleavened bread, the proper feast of unleavened bread? Now, what I'd like to do is compare that New King James section to some other versions. We're going to look first at Matthew 26:17. Don't forget our context. We're going to make the assessment that it's Abib 13. Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? So we'll leave up the New King James Version on the very top. We just did that. And where we have this rainbow colored bar, we're going to look at two other versions. Only chose two. You can choose some other ones. But we'll look at the NIV. This is what the NIV has. On the first day, notice that Y, okay, of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yahusha and asked, capital F and a U and a capital B here. TS, that's the scriptures. This is the 2009 version. There's a lot of people that like the scripture version as well. And that has to say, on the first day of unleavened bread, look at that. These are proper nouns. In these other versions, for Matthew 26:17, do you see that the emphasis seems to be on the feast of unleavened bread? So that's what's happening when we compare Matthew 26:17 to some other versions.
Okay,
Let's
now
look at Mark 14:12, Kim.
Yep, we're going to look at Mark 14:12 with some other versions. And our context again is where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? And the New King James Version is listed right there for you. And if we compare that with the NIV, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb. Notice the proper denoting of Feast of Unleavened Bread with capital letters. And in the scriptures, TS 2009, and on the first day of unleavened bread, when they were slaughtering the Pesach lamb, his taught ones said, again, capitalizing there the U and the B for unleavened bread. So in these other versions of Mark 14:12, does it appear, that the emphasis is still on this feast of unleavened bread, capitalized as a proper noun? And let's take a look now at Luke 22:7. Our context again of Abib 13. Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? We have the New King James Version. Then came the day of unleavened bread. Notice the capital letters, U and B, when the Passover must be killed. And in the NIV, it states, then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So we have a capitalization again of the unleavened bread that day. Is that when the Passover lamb was sacrificed? And Scriptures 2009, and the day of unleavened bread came when the Pesach had to be slaughtered. Again, a capitalization. You are seeing this in these other versions of Luke 22:7. Are we seeing that the emphasis is still on this feast of unleavened bread, the feast of unleavened bread, capitalized, a proper.
Mhm. And that's where a lot of people have confusion. They see those capital letters. So everything seems to indicate the Passover preparations were taking place on that first day of the festival of unleavened bread. So something's not making sense here. If the disciples were actually planning preparations for Passover with Yahusha on the first day of unleavened bread festival, there is definitely something not in alignment with the Passover statute commands in Exodus. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at the King James Version. For Matthew, Mark, and Luke, remember, King James Version. Our context is still Abib 13 is what we're saying. Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? They actually thought that they were going to be eating the Passover sometime with Yahusha. Let's look at Matthew 26:17. Pay attention to what's happening. Now on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahusha saying to him, that's Matthew 26. Let's look at Mark 14 and Luke 22. On the first day of unleavened bread, we have lowercase here. On the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said to him. Then Luke 22:7, it says, then came the day of unleavened bread when the Passover must be killed. It does sound confusing, doesn't it? But you know what? In the King James, there is no emphasis on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this festival. Is there more to consider? Were the disciples preparing for a feast with a small f, or a festival with a capital F, or a feast with a capital F? Let's check out a few facts to see if there is a difference between these three very similar terms.
For a closer examination on just one day. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say this. Matthew 26:17 and 19. Now on the first of the unleavened bread. Yes, I left out the italicized words because they're not there in the original. Notice the small u on the unleavened bread. That removes the noun proper for the feast and provides us opportunity to think of unleavened bread as the physical identity that we eat. Start again. Now, on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahusha, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" So the disciples did as Yahusha had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. Mark 14:12 and 6. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, and it has lamb there, doesn't the statute say that the Passover lamb was to be killed on the, or is to be sacrificed is a better word, on Abib 14? And yet the first day of the festival of unleavened bread is on Abib 15. So when we look at these words, unleavened bread, with the lowercase letters, it makes it clear it's speaking about the actual piece of bread itself and not the festival. Keep that in mind, and I'm going to read this again. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" So his disciples went out and came into the city and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Luke 22:7-9 and verse 13. Then come the day of unleavened bread, and we have the note there, see Exodus 12:18, because that verse defines very, very clearly that the physical piece of bread, the matzot, the unleavened bread, must be eaten on the Passover meal. Keep that in mind when I read this sentence, when you see the lowercase letters for unleavened bread. Then come the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. So he sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat." So they said to him, "Where do you want us to prepare?" So they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. And I want to note here, it's just one day, singular. That's why the Y is colored red. The Feast of Unleavened Bread has 7 days, and here it is specifying one singular day.
So here's something to think about then. Was that day, that one day, when they killed the Passover, was that also the capital day with a one Y there, singular? Was that also the day when the unleavened bread was eaten the first time? Or was that day the first day of the unleavened bread festival? Notice the capitalized. So we're at an important crossroad decision here. And now we are at a point where a decision is going to have to be made. And do we have to choose between the Synoptic Gospels or the book of John? They seem to be a little conflict. Or would it be better to see all of the Gospels laid out in harmony with each other? And that's what we're going to look at.
So let's try to chart these 4 Gospels. Let's look at Matthew 26:17. And we're just going to change the wording a little bit so that maybe it's better understood. These words in the square brackets, let's just look and see, because we know that there was something else going on. Now, as the first of the unleavened bread day was approaching, the disciples came to Yahusha, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Let me read it again. Now, as the first of the unleavened bread day was approaching. What day was that? What day was approaching where you had unleavened bread for the very first time? The context and the time reference must be on the 3rd cycle before the Last Supper. The Last Supper was right here on the 13th of Abib. Look at that. And what was coming? The Passover. The Passover was coming. It was the first day that they would be eating unleavened bread. And that day was approaching. They knew it. They knew that they should not be eating leavened bread on that day of Passover. When the Passover day comes, they would normally prepare to have that sacrifice and to eat their meal after the sunset, during the Areb, and into the night season. This was where the Passover meal was commanded to be eaten. And then what happened after that? The festival of the unleavened bread also had 7 days, and those days were approaching, just like the Passover day was approaching when they were at that Last Supper with Yahusha. There is only one way for the Synoptic Gospels to be understood, and that is that there were days approaching that were connected to unleavened bread, and the Passover day is the first day that is connected to unleavened bread, and it was going to be arriving very, very soon. It was impossible for the disciples to place this request on either the Passover day, which would have been on the midst of the week, a 4th cycle, and it would not have been on the 11th bread, 5th cycle of the week in that year. Let's read Matthew 26:17 again. Now, as the first of that unleavened bread day was approaching. That is when the disciples came to Yahushua saying, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" They actually thought that he was going to eat the Passover meal with them. We're going to talk about that more later. Translation discrepancies? Yes, there are. Remember, John's Gospel was written much, much later. It's very likely that the Synoptic Gospels were already translated into Greek by the time that John wrote his Gospel. You know, John would have seen the definite necessity to clarify the proper meaning around that word day of unleavened bread, meaning Passover. He wanted to take all his readers back to what the Hebrew mindset would have originally understood. And today, most translations have taken on a meaning that was never intended by any Hebrew writer or believer. And that is why oftentimes we have a lot of people saying that Yahushua died on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread because of these verses. So this is probably the most important chart of the whole PowerPoint. Are we talking about a feast with a small f? Are we talking about a feast with a capital F? Or are we talking about a festival with a capital F? Let's just take a look in Genesis 19, verse 3. This is the story about Lot when the angels came to take them out of the city, and Lot pressed upon them greatly. This is the angels that came to visit, and they turned in unto him and entered into his house. And he made them a feast, it's a small f, and they did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. This feast, Mishtah, it means to drink by implication. Also, look what it also means. A feast is a banquet where you're drinking and eating or feasting. This is just an ordinary feast, okay? Just a small f feast. For our covenant calendar definitions in this particular teaching, we want to look at the full Passover festival, and it's going to include the Passover day, the unleavened bread festival, and that has 7 days, and then there is a wave sheaf festival as well. But look, the Passover festival is the first day, and it is also the first feast day that has unleavened bread present. It's the first day where unleavened bread is commanded. And then you have 7 days of the festival of unleavened bread. It's a chag. It's a festival for 7 days where you're commanded to eat unleavened bread every single day. And within those 7 days, you will have a wave sheaf festival as well. All of these 3 festivals together designate the full Passover festival. It has these 3 components. So Passover can have many different definitions. You have to look at the context. On Abib 13, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples asked Yahushua where to prepare that Passover meal. That Passover meal for Abib 14, that day was supposed to have a feast, and it was supposed to have unleavened bread. That day of unleavened bread was approaching. That Passover day of unleavened bread was approaching.
So as we look at the Gospel of John and as we're studying, in many studies, one must watch the content. And also watch the content, especially with words like a and the, as these words will cause a difference in the final context. And as you're studying, compare other versions of Scripture. And fourth here, Bible versions that may have italicized words and capital letters. Be aware of that, where they do not belong. And that can lead to a different context if you're not paying attention. And lastly, as you're studying, be sure to check and see what John has to say, because oftentimes his gospel is what solves the controversy.
So we're ready now to start our first witness. Remember, we have 3 of them. So our first witness, so for which day of the week it is and which date of the month for Passover. The Synoptic Gospels seem to have some challenging phrases. So let's look at John in chapters 13, 18, and 19.
Okay, as we consider John's gospel, then, have you ever wondered why there are 4 gospels for one story? Have you ever wondered why John's gospel is different than the synoptics? Many scholars believe that John wrote his gospel late in the 1st century, decades after the synoptic gospels had been written. And Greek-speaking Gentiles comprised a significant portion of the assembly. Those are believing in the Roman midnight commencement for the day start. We see John's gospel, it differs from the synoptic gospels because of the number of Gentile converts pouring into the assembly. He had to include these missed details that separate truth from error, especially when the anti-Jewish bias began to take root. And as we consider John's gospel, we see he went to great lengths to emphasize the Messiah's heritage and to remove all possibilities of lingering doubt, especially those around the details of covenant calendar, timing of events, and other such things. So we're going to begin now John's account of the Last Supper and a review.
In John 13, 1-5, let's read it. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Yahushua knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. Verse 2, John is the only one that records this. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Yahushua, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from Yahuwah and went to Yahuwah, he riseth from supper, and laid aside his garments, and he took a towel and girded himself. And after he had poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. However, there's some other details that need to be noted. Just want to review. Verse 1 plainly states that the timing was before the feast of the Passover, which is always on the 14th day of the 1st month. So logic alone demands that the betrayal of Yahushua must occur before his sacrifice on the tree. In verse 2, John shows the Last Supper took place on the same night that Judas Iscariot betrayed Yahusha. Does this sound very different from the Synoptic Gospels? They don't record anything about this Last Supper. Again, John's timing of the Last Supper is obviously referring to the night of Abib 13. Sadly, the Synoptic Gospels do not have the same clarity in some areas, but John goes on to reiterate several times that these events took place before Passover. Clearly, this Passover meal, traditionally eaten on the evening of Abib 14, had not been observed yet. And why is that? Because the Passover lamb could only be eaten after the Passover sacrifice is slain, bled, skinned, and roasted. And we all know that that's in Torah. By default alone, the Passover meal could not have been observed by our Messiah, his disciples, or any other Jews. In John 13, verses 21, 26, and 27, these are the events following the Last Supper and the foot washing. Look what it says. When Yahusha had thus said, he was troubled in spirit, and he testified, and he said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you, talking about Judas, one of you shall betray me. Yahusha answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And after the sop, Satan entered into him. Then said Yahusha unto him, That thou doest, do quickly. These events can only occur on the night season of Abib 13, which happens to be the day before Passover on Abib 14. And now it gets interesting in verses 28 to 30. Now, no man at the table knew for what intent he spake this unto him, that Yahusha spake unto Judas. For some of them thought, because Judas had the bag, that Yahusha had said unto him, Buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. He then, having received the sop, went immediately out, and it was night. Once Judas left, Yahusha gave his last words to the remaining 11 disciples, and in chapters 14 to 17, it includes approximately 3,000 words that are not recorded by the Synoptic Gospels. But did you note in verse 29, did you catch the calendar lingo? The disciples thought Yahusha said, Buy those things. This is obviously not the night of the 14th, because Yahusha is still with them.
And John has many extra details. Chapters 14 through 17. John is the only gospel writer that records many additional instructions from Yahusha to his disciples, from the time Judas left the group until they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. So here are some of the details. We see in chapter 14, the revealing of his Father and the promise of the Helper. He speaks of lessons on the vine and the branches in chapter 15. And also in that chapter, the coming rejection. In chapter 16, the work of the Ruach, or the Holy Spirit. And finally, Yahusha's prayer for himself and others in chapter 17.
John's other important details. Let's consider 3 examples of details in John's Gospel not found in the Synoptic Gospels. John 18, verse 28. Then they led Yahusha from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And their Passover on their lunar-based calendar would be starting that evening, again, on their lunar calendar. Very, very clear calendar terminology in this scripture. This early morning, that's dawn, is in the context of the Passover day. John records all the Passion events with Roman reckoning of time and the day beginning at midnight. And this is revealed very clearly in Matthew with Pilate's wife. Therefore, the early morning is correct for both dawn and sunset day start and Roman reckoning. They're all inclusive here. Notice, no one had eaten the Passover meal yet. It was still in the future. John's other important details. John 19:14. We need to remember here in the 18th chapter, verse 28, John has just declared it was early morning. It was dawn. Let's read verse 14. And it was the what? The preparation of the Passover. That is your Passover day that starts at dawn. Start again. Now it was the preparation of the Passover. That's the 14th on Roman time. And about the 6th hour, that would be the 6th hour from midnight. And that is Roman reckoning. Why from midnight? Because John was living in Antioch at that time, and he was writing to a Roman people so that they would understand what he was writing. He met them with their terminology and their understanding. So when John says it was about the 6th hour and it was at dawn, he is declaring the Roman day, the Roman type of reckoning starts at midnight. That's why it says the 6th hour. When you understand this Roman reckoning concept, that fully aligns John with all the synoptic gospels. The importance of this cannot be overestimated. I'm going to read the verse again just so we collect our thoughts. Now it was the preparation of the Passover and about the 6th hour, and he, that would be Pilate, said to the Jews, behold your king. The synoptic gospels count the 6th hour from a dawn day start. You can see that in Matthew 20, Matthew 27:45, Mark 15:33, and Luke 23:44. The 6th hour ends at the hour of noon, when the sun was darkened, till the 9th hour. The timing of John's account aligns perfectly. There is no difference between John's account and the synoptic gospels. They are one and the same, just using a different terminology from a different view. John 19:31. The Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation, it's the 14th, that the bodies should not remain upon the cross, or the tree in actuality, on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. Please note the lowercase letters. And it was the high day, or it was the first unleavened bread convocation. It is a convocation. That is what is recorded in Torah. They besought Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Interesting note here. John is the only gospel writer to verify the high Sabbath is the first convocation, or the makra in Hebrew terminology. It is the first makra of unleavened bread. There is no indication, I'll say this one more time, there is no indication in Scripture that a high Shabbat must include 2 Shabbats on one day, as some teach. There's no indication of that at all, not in Scripture.
Let's take a look at the unleavened bread convocation observance here. So we see in Exodus 12:16 and 17, that being the book of the covenant, that on the first day, and that is of unleavened bread, the 15th day of the first month, on the first day there shall be a holy convocation. And on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. And we can read also in Leviticus 23, 6 and 7. That's the book of the law. And on the 15th day of the first month, Abib, is the feast of unleavened bread to Yahuwah. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So John has clarity with details. And as you can see, John is pointing repeatedly that the Last Supper, the betrayal of Judas, Yahusha's arrest, and the beginning of his trials, they all occurred before the Passover cycle of Abib 14. Therefore, the conclusion is the Last Supper also occurred on the day before Passover. John 19:31 shows with certainty the day following the Passover preparation day was the annual high Shabbat. It was a rest within the convocation, the first day of unleavened bread. Note the capital letters, the first day of unleavened bread, which fell annually on Abib 15. And again, remember, as stated before, that the definition of a high Shabbat is not an annual Shabbat, the definition of a high Shabbat is not an annual feast Shabbat that's falling on the weekly capital Shabbat, 7th day. I'll read that again. The definition of a high Shabbat is not an annual feast Shabbat. It's not a rest period that also happens to fall on the weekly 7th day Shabbat. Yahuwah is commanding the Israelites to observe this mikra, this convocation, every year. And it.
Let me review here. Collect our thoughts. There's a lot of information here. Synoptic accounts of the Last Supper. The disciples came to Yahusha on Abib 13. Number 2, they asked him where he wanted them to prepare to eat the Passover meal, which would normally occur the next night on Abib 14. At least it appears these disciples assumed they would be eating the Passover meal with Yahusha once again. Number 3, Yahusha instructed Peter and John how to find the place where they should prepare to eat the Passover on the night of Abib 14. That is because they thought they would be eating the meal together again with Yahusha. He had told them many times that he was going to die, but they did not hear his words. They still thought they would be eating the Passover meal with Yahusha. Number 4, he told them the owner of the house would show them a large furnished upper room, and that is what happened. Point 5, Mark and Luke both state it was there in that room that they were to prepare for the Passover meal to be eaten. You can read that in Mark 14, verse 15, and Luke 22, verse 12. After the supper, and this is early the next day, the following synoptic testimonies follow the events of the Last Supper the next morning. So the question is, what morning date was this? And we need to remember the words of the scribes and Pharisees, not at the feast. They were not going to crucify Yahusha on their festival. So let's read Matthew 27, 1-2. When the morning was come, that's dawn, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Yahusha to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Now we need to remember, when Yahusha was on the tree, he said, "It has been accomplished." Be statute for the Passover lamb sacrifice was to be on, or is to be on, Abib 14. I guess was a better terminology. It was to be on Abib 14. So when they said that they were not going to kill Yahusha at the feast, they stick to their words. We need to look at this carefully with calendar eyes. Mark 15, verse 1. And straightway in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Yahusha and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. Luke 23, verse 1. And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. Luke has no details of the morning. Typically, the Passover meal is to be eaten the evening of Abib 14, after the sacrifice has occurred, according to the Torah statutes. Remember, when the sacrifice was done, they had to take the blood and spread it on the doorposts in the original Passover in Egypt. That meal could only occur after that sacrifice had been done. And it was not to have been performed the evening before. In Egypt, they did not take the blood of the lamb and spread it on the doorposts, and then the following day sacrifice the lamb. That's not how it works. So I'm going to read this all one more time. Typically, the Passover meal is to be eaten the evening after, the evening of Abib 14, after the sacrifice, according to Torah statutes, and not the evening before, on the 13th, which is about 21 hours before the sacrifice. So what does this information have to do with the Last Supper? How do we correlate this? John has more details of what happened early on Abib 14. John 18:28. Then led they Yahusha from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early. Again, that's dawn. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, that they might eat the Passover. Note here, if it was already their Passover, they would have been defiled. What calendar were they on? There is a 12-hour offset between the calendar of the covenant and the lunar calendar of the Jews. This factor is ultra brilliantly glaring in our faces, if only we recognize it. The timing implications in this verse go very, very deep. Continuing on here, question. Who is being referred to as they? Is it the Pharisees or the other disciples? Whoever it was, the Passover meal had not been eaten yet, neither by the Pharisees or any disciples of Yahusha at the Last Supper the night before. In John 18:28, he said it was early when Yahusha was led from Caiaphas to Pilate. How early was it? John 19:14 is a very special verse. John, and I like to call him John the reporter because he speaks as it is. So what does he say here? Now it was the preparation of the Passover. Remember, this is a dawn start for the Passover. Now it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. Again, that is the 6 a.m., and it's about 6 hours from Roman reckoning time of midnight. And he, that would be Pilate, said to the Jews, "Behold your king." Here, John's specific timing is about 12 hours after the Last Supper, with at least another 12 hours to a Passover meal. Note, a Passover meal. Note for Synoptic Gospels.
So a note for the Synoptic Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, they both record that Yahusha was led to Pilate early in the morning, marking the Passover of Abib 14. Along with Luke, their record of the 6th hour is when the sky became darkened, hiding our sacrificial Messiah.
And now we see that the timing of the four Gospels is finally perfectly synchronized. Now that the Gospels have been aligned where it seems they did not agree, let's examine an area where they do agree. I'm sorry, I'll read that again. Now that the Gospels have been aligned where it seems they did not agree, let's examine an area where they do agree, about 12 hours after the Last Supper. Do the Gospel writers agree a new day begins with sunset?
Okay, this is a really important slide. And Tim, would you be able to help us through this slide? It's got a lot of details on it. Just open your mic, Tim.
Where do the Gospels agree? These four testimonies all follow the events of the Last Supper. Typically, the Passover meal would be eaten the evening of Abib 14. By that time, Yahusha had laid down his life. Note that. By that time, Yahusha had laid down his life. Matthew 27, 57 to 58. When the even was come, the even, that's the mixture, that is after sunset. When the even was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Yahusha's disciple. He went to Pilate and begged the body of Yahusha. Note, this is after sunset. Mark 15, 42 to 43. And now, when the even was come, again, that word even is the time frame of the mixture of darkness overtaking the light. It is the evening mixture after the sun has set. I read this again. And now, when the even was come, because it was the preparation, what happened to the sunset changing the day? Why is it that the sunset did not change the day in this instant? For if the sunset had changed the day, Mark would have written here, and it was already the Sabbath. But that's not what is written. Start again. And now, when the even was come, because it was the preparation, that's Abib 14, that is what? It's the day before the Sabbath. That would be the unleavened bread Sabbath on the 15th. It was still in this night, going into the night season. Mark tells you it was still Abib 14, and it was still the preparation, and it is still the day before. The deep calendar terminology here. Verse 43, note what happens after sunset. Note what happens on the preparation night. Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which also waited for the kingdom of Yahuwah, came and went in boldly unto Pilate. And what did he do after sunset? He craved the body of Yahusha. Please note, the sunset system of day start is completely and utterly and totally obliterated, annihilated in these verses of Mark. Let's continue to Luke 23, 54 to 55. And that day was the preparation. Now, Luke doesn't record when they took the body of Yahusha, but he does record about the burial process. That burial process went through the whole night of Abib 14, the preparation day. How do we know that? Let's start again. And the day was the preparation. Obviously, that's before the Sabbath. And Luke says, and the Sabbath drew on. That word in Greek there is epiphosko. Hopefully I said that right, Maria. Epiphosko. And the meaning is to grow light. Note, at sunset, it grows dark. But here Luke says it was the time of the preparation, and the Sabbath was about to grow light. That's just before dawn. Continuing on, and the women also, which came with him from Galilee, followed after and beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. Does John agree? John 19, verse 31. The Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation, Abib 14, that the bodies should not remain on the tree on the Sabbath day, that would be the approaching Abib 15 Sabbath, coming at dawn, for that Sabbath was a high day. Note the small case letters. He besought Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. They wanted to have all this done before the Shabbat of Abib 15 came at dawn. So what does this information have to do with the Last Supper? Very direct information.
Mhm. So now that we've gone through a lot of information of the Synoptic Gospels and John, we're ready to put this onto a chart. It's probably the most important chart in the study. So let's see what we have. One example, though, the Gospels all agree that the day begins in the morning with the dawn light, the first light. And why is that? Because the even or the Erev of the Passover day does not change the date to Abib 15. So let's look. We're going to fill in this chart with our dawn day beginning Passover right there at that purple bar. The next thing that happens is after Yehusha's put on the tree at the 6th hour, he's on the tree for 3 hours. At the 6th hour, there is darkness. That would be high noon. And then at the 3rd hour, he says, or at the 9th hour, pardon me, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he says, it is accomplished. That is when he let his spirit go. The 12th hour begins the Erev portion of the day cycle. After the sunset, the 12th hour is the Erev. This is the midst of this day and the midst of the week. In box number 5, Mark 15 says that the even was come. The even, marking right here, right after sunset. The even was come, and it is still the Passover preparation day. It is the day before the unleavened bread convocation that follows on the 15th. And another thing in Mark 1:32, he's very specific that when the sun is set, that is when the even comes. So the even comes right after sunset. It's not an evening before sunset. In box number 6, we're going to look at Matthew 27 because he says, when even was come, that is when Joseph went and asked Pilate for the body. It was not before sunset. In box number 7, we'll look at John. John 19 says that this was the preparation day, the day before the high Shabbat. And then in box number 8, let's bring it all together with Luke 23. Luke is declaring that day was the preparation and the high Shabbat drew on with the approaching light of dawn. Very interesting how all the Gospels are now coming together. With the burial of Yehusha during this night season, and just as the dawn was coming on for that unleavened bread convocation, that is when they closed up the tomb. All of these events agree. So you can see here that the Last Supper would have had to been back here on Abib 13. This is when Judas was asked to leave the group because he had some work to do in betraying Yehusha. And definitely this Last Supper right here was on Abib 13 before all of these events happened.
Yes, it's so clear when you lay it all out on a chart. There's alignment. Let's compare now some other Bible commentaries. We don't always do this, but we're going to just take a peek and see if they have anything to say about this meal called the Last Supper. And Tim's going to share some things with us.
Jacob Neusner. In Jacob Neusner's translation of the Jewish Mishnah, we can see why the disciples would have been concerned with preparing for the Passover the evening of the 13th, even though the Passover meal wouldn't be eaten until the next night. In his quote from Pesachim 1:3, please remember, he's writing with the understanding that Abib 14 begins at sunset on Abib 13. Pesachim is the third tractate of Seder Moed of the Mishnah and of the Talmud. It is concerned mainly with the laws of the Jewish holiday Passover, as well as the Passover lamb offering. Please note the difference, I should say, between the Jewish Passover on the lunar calendar and the Passover of Yahuwah. Two different calendars, two different timing. Continuing here, note, even though Neusner is using the reasoning that Abib 14 begins the evening before, in his context, he is speaking of de-leavening and possibly anointing the chosen room so that it should be clean from all questionable activity in the past. This rented room might have even needed a good spring cleaning. Neusner on Pesachim 1 verse 3. R. Judah says, they seek out leaven, number 1, on the night of the 14th, number 2, on the 14th in the morning, and 3, at the time of removal. B, the sages say, if one did not seek out leaven on the night of the 14th, that would be after sunset on the 13th, he may seek it out on the 14th. If he did not seek it out on the 14th, let him seek it out on the appointed time. That would be 11 a.m. to 12 noon on the 14th. D, if he did not seek it out at the appointed time, let him seek it out after the appointed time, to nightfall. This is to the removal of all leaven. It seems very, very interesting, the stipulations and how it can be done. Let's look at New Unger's Bible Dictionary. Unger, I hope I said that right, I'm not sure. Unger confirms how the Jews prepared for the observance of the Passover. On the evening of the 13th of Nisan, which until that of the 14th was called the preparation for the Passover, John 19:14, every head of the family searched for and collected, note this, by the light of a candle, all the leaven. A candle. Very, very deep thoughts can go with that. Let's continue. Before beginning the search, he pronounced the following benediction. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who hast sanctified us with thy commandments and hast enjoined us to remove the leaven. After the search, he said, whatever leaven remains in my possession, which I cannot see, behold, it is null and accounted as the dust of the earth. Page 411 in his book of festivals.
Okay, Maria, she's going to help us with some slides as well.
Okay. Prepare the Passover. What does this phrase really mean? The phrase prepare the Passover, found in Matthew 26:19, Mark 14:16, and Luke 22:13, comes from the Greek phrase etimasan to Pascha. According to Strong Concordance, the Greek verb root etimazo means to make ready, prepare, and to make the necessary preparations, get everything ready. This is drawn from the Oriental custom of sending persons on before kings on their journeys to level the roads and make them passable. Clearly, one of the reasons the disciples questioned Yahusha about where they were going to eat Passover meal was because Exodus 13:7. Torah statute states, neither shall there be leaven seen with thee in all thy quarters.
Hey, prepare the Passover, G2090. What does this phrase really mean? The night the Passover meal was eaten, The Israelites followed the command to remove all leaven from their dwelling places. Exodus 12:18. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. So note, unleavened bread was eaten on a total of 8 days when you're counting from the 14th to the 21st. The following penalty was prescribed for eating leavened bread during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Exodus 12:15. For a 7-day period shall you eat matzos, or unleavened bread, but on the previous day, that is the preparation day, you shall nullify the leaven from your homes. For anyone who eats leavened food, that soul shall be cut off from Israel from the first day, 15th, to the 7th day, the 21st. That's out of the Stone Edition Tanakh.
How could the disciples not understand? When the disciples questioned Yahusha about where they were going to eat the Passover meal the next night, that would be Abib 14, they still did not fully understand his life would be laid down by then. The Messiah would not be able to eat any Passover lamb because he was destined to be sacrificed as the Passover lamb. 1 Corinthians 5:7. Yahusha did not cause undue grief. Instead of explaining to them again that he would be in the process of being buried when the time came to eat the Passover meal, he simply told his disciples where to prepare to eat the Passover meal. They did not want to listen to the words that he had to said, or that he said to them. So he said, go ahead, prepare the Passover meal. After all, that's what they wanted to hear, as they did not seem to hear or comprehend that Yahusha had already told them many times he was going to Jerusalem to die. Yahusha used their final meal together on Abib 13 to instruct his disciples one last time before his death. What else did Yahusha provide? After Judas left the group, Yahusha provided many final instructions to his friends. It's likely the disciples knew they were gathering together on the evening of the 13th to receive some teachings or instructions, as was common with a rabbi and his followers before the feast season began. Yahusha did give instructions to be remembered forever after, just as he showed them, which to this day is also a chag. He gave these instructions on how to remember his sacrifice.
And continuing on with what else did Yahusha provide? Is it possible that Yahusha provided this Last Supper room as he knew that the disciples would have need for it the next day after the Passover, even though they thought that they would be using the room for another purpose? You know what? Yahusha chose this room from one of his believers where he knew his disciples would be safe from the Jews who would be seeking after them. Is it possible that this is the room where Yahusha met them on the day of his wave-sheaf appearance? He made all the arrangements. So we're ready to do a review for our first witness. What is the day of the week and what is the date of the month? From Daniel 9:27, we know that the crucifixion was on the 4th cycle, or a Wednesday, and the Last Supper was the day before. So the day? Absolutely, the 3rd cycle. It was a Tuesday. We also know Passover is always on Abib 14. So the Last Supper was the day before, and it was not a Passover meal. So what is the date? The confirmation is Abib 13.
Now we're going to look at our second witness for study on the day and the date. And that is this phrase, with desire, I have desired. And the true intent of this phrase will be examined when we look at Luke 22, 15 and 16. We're trying to understand this phrase, with desire I have desired. Luke 22, 15 and 16. And he said unto them, with desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of Yahuwah. So what does this phrase really mean? With fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover. And Maria will help us with this.
With desire, I have desired. Luke 22:15 has been used to support the assertion that the Messiah and his disciples ate a meal called the Passover meal. Is this so? In this scripture, Yahusha says, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. The Greek phrase translated with fervent desire, I have desired, is epithymia epithymisa. It literally means with desire, I desired. With desire, I have desired. Strong's G 1939, epithymia, epithymia from G 1937, a longing, especially for what is forbidden. Epithymia is an exegetical dictionary of the New Testament. The first word of this phrase, with desire I have desired, epithymia, is a noun. According to the exegetical dictionary of the New Testament, usually this word has the ambivalent sense desire, strive for, long to, have, do, be something. It can also be used for forbidden desire. Yahusha uses epithymia in this sense in Luke 22:15.
Rar Fenton and his translation. Let's have a look here. In his Bible translation, Farrar Fenton accurately captures the meaning of Yahusha's words in these verses, Luke 22:15 to 16. And he said to them, I have longingly desired, epithymia, epithymesa, to eat this Passover with you before my suffering. Myself, I believe that comes from a deep portion of his heart. When he said, I have longingly desired, I believe he meant that. He wanted to be with his disciples. Verse 16. However, I tell you that I shall not eat of it until it can be administered in the kingdom of Yahuwah. That will be the final fulfillment of Passover. Do you see the clarity in this verse that the Last Supper is not the Passover? But he had asked them to prepare for the Passover, knowing full well they might not be eating it anyway. There was an awful lot of upheaval on that particular day. This is another clarification to show this Last Supper was not on Abib 14, but only on Abib 13.
And that ends our witness, our second witness on I have desired for this day and this date. Yahusha's desire to eat the Passover, thus finalizing the fulfillment thereof, will only be realized in the kingdom. In this account, we now know what is the day? Absolutely. It was the third cycle, a Tuesday. Therefore, the day and the date of the Last Supper was not the Passover meal on Abib 14. So again, with our second witness, what is the date? It is absolutely Abib 13 for the Last Supper. And that finishes the second witness. We're ready to go into the third witness for this study on what day of the week and what date of the month. And it's talking about a special meal. You might find this really interesting. The question is, could the last gathering of Yahusha and his disciples have been a very special preparatory meal?
David H. Stern, he's a Jewish scholar, and he writes about the Last Supper meal. The Last Supper is considered by most scholars to have been a Passover meal or Seder. Many Pesach themes are deepened, reinforced, and given new levels of meaning by events in the life of Yahusha the Messiah and by his words on this night. However, Joseph Shulam has suggested that it may not have been the Seder, but a Seudat Mitzvah, the celebratory banquet accompanying performance of a commandment such as the wedding or the Brit Milah. Here is the background for his argument. When a rabbi and his students finish studying a tractate of the Talmud, they celebrate with a Seudat Mitzvah, also called a banquet of completion or graduation. A fast of the firstborn, expressing gratitude for the saving of Israel's firstborn sons from the 10th plague, has been prescribed for the day of the Pesach, Nisan 14, and he's referring to the sunset of Nisan 13, at least since Mishnaic times. When it is necessary to eat a Seudat Mitzvah, this takes precedence over a fast. Note that, precedence over a fast. With a modicum of foresight, a rabbi can plan to complete a tractate on Nisan 14, thus avoid having to fast. Doing so is not construed as cheating. Interesting terminology. It's not construed as cheating, and in fact, it has become the custom. Would that be like making up your own rules? Do we have that ability? Stern's quote continues. Yes, we have that ability, but do we have the authority? I guess is a better question. Continuing. The tradition of the fast of the firstborn dates at least from Mishnaic times, but Shulam reasons, if it goes back a couple of centuries more to the time of Yahusha, and if this Seudat Mitzvah custom applied in the first century to the completing of any course of study, then Yahusha might have arranged to have himself and his Talmudim finish reading a book of the Tanakh on Nisan 14. Or, since Yahusha knew he was going to die, he may have regarded it as appropriate to complete his disciples' earthly course of study with a banquet. This solution would also resolve the perceived conflict between Yochanan and the Synoptic Gospels over the timing of the Last Supper. A conflict? I don't believe there is any conflict. I believe there is perfect linear alignment. From the Companion Bible, in the Companion Bible comment on Luke 22:15, Bullinger states that the Last Supper Yahusha and his disciples ate was not the eating of the lamb, but the chagagah, or feast, which preceded it. He goes on to explain that it follows, therefore, that the Lord being crucified on the preparation day could not have eaten of the Passover lamb, which was not slain until the evening of the 14th of Abib. He writes that afternoon. Thus it is clear that no Passover lamb could have been eaten on the Last Supper on the previous evening. Note here, Bullinger knows Yahuwah's statutes quite well. He writes very well accordingly. No lamb. Oh, sorry.
Lamb at the Last Supper? So none of the four Gospels mention a lamb being eaten at the Last Supper. The time had not yet come to slay the Passover when the Messiah and his disciples gathered for the Last Supper. And in addition, the verses of Deuteronomy 16:2 and 5-6, they are Torah instructions given for the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. Even after the Last Supper, were the disciples still intending to follow through with the Torah guidelines for Passover? Let's read Deuteronomy 16:2, 5, and 6. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto Yahuwah thy Elohim of the flock and the herd in the place which Yahuwah shall choose to place his name there. Thou mayst not sacrifice the Passover within any of thy gates, which Yahuwah thy Elohim giveth thee, but at the place which Yahuwah thy Elohim shall choose to place his name in, there thou shalt sacrifice the Passover at even, at the going down of the sun, at the season of Abib, that thou comest forth out of Egypt. So note, at the Last Supper, Yahusha had to show the disciples that no more sacrifices were necessary after this new covenant confirming meal, instituting new ordinances. Soon they would understand the reason for such a huge change given on Abib 13, that day before Passover.
So the instructions from Moses, yes, he recorded the explicit instructions regarding the proper place to sacrifice the Passover in Deuteronomy. The Israelites were not allowed to sacrifice the Passover anywhere they wanted, but only at the place where Yahuwah chose to put his name. And during Yahusha's life, the temple in Jerusalem was the place where Elohim had placed his name. And that's where the priests sacrificed the Passover lambs in according with that command. The synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not conflict with John's account of the Last Supper when you understand them correctly. A careful study of all four gospels shows that Yahusha and his disciples did not eat the commanded Passover meal during their last time together before Yahusha died on his Passover, because no one can eat the Passover lamb or a Passover meal on Abib 13 before it is sacrificed and roasted on Abib 14. They simply prepared for the upcoming Passover festival, fully intending to partake of a Passover meal the very next day on Abib 14.
A bit of review here. At the Last Supper, the disciples could have eaten some type of celebratory or preparatory meal in Yahusha's presence the evening of Abib 13. B. It was at this supper that Yahusha himself, as the high priest or the Kohen HaGadol of the Melchizedek order, he established this new way to celebrate the Passover without the lamb, through the simple symbols of the bread and wine. Then he also endorsed the foot washing. He endorsed it by providing the example. Note, Yahusha did not partake of these symbols. C. After the meal, the foot washing activity, Yahusha once again sat at the table to instruct his disciples and give another clue that there was a betrayer in the group. D. The next clue was the betrayer would receive the sop. E. This is when Judas Iscariot arose and left after he received the sop, illustrating the removal of leaven from the group to carry out his plan to betray Yahusha to the Jewish authorities. This illustration of the removal of the leaven from the group is very, very important. We need to recognize this. F. Would it not seem appropriate for Yahusha to use leavened sop to designate the leavened disciple in the group that was soon to betray him? Seems fairly appropriate for me. A conclusion here. Yahusha and his disciples obviously could not have eaten a Passover lamb with their meal the night of Abib 13. The scriptures, through Paul, clearly state the Messiah was our Passover, 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that Yahusha died at the 9th hour. That would be 3 p.m. Roman reckoning of time. This coincides with the same time as recorded by Josephus for when the slaughter of the Passover lambs commenced. Yahusha fulfilled the symbolism of the Passover lamb by giving his life on his covenant calendar, Abib 14. I like to turn those words around, and I like to say it was on his calendar of the covenant that was blood ratified on Mount Sinai. Continuing, no future lambs, no future Passover lambs had to ever be sacrificed again. They were terminated at this sacrifice at Golgotha.
Mhm. So that kind of finishes up that little bit of a review, but we did hear a phrase about the fast of the firstborn. We're just going to look into that a little bit because there's been considerable discussion on who ate what and on what day was it. In this section, we're going to look at that. So what do we know for sure? Well, we know there was no lamb at this Last Supper. Number two, we know that the disciples partook of the bread and the wine as emblems of Yahusha's body. That was in the other study about the bread. There is no record that Yahusha partook of these emblems, and there's no reason for him to do so in the first place. However, remember that he began his ministry with fasting, and he fasted many times up to his Passover sacrifice that would fulfill the Torah type. Number 5, it is understood that the lamb chosen on Abib 10 for the Passover sacrifice, that lamb was fasted for the last 4 days of its life. Because Yahusha fulfills all the types, then he would also fulfill the fasting requirement as the Passover lamb. Could it be that if this Last Supper was a celebratory meal, that he would have been fasting anyway? He certainly did qualify for the fast of the firstborn, even if it was a tradition. Yahusha fasted often during his full ministry, knowing that he would soon face a great deal of temptation. And certainly this was the case for the upcoming events at his Passover. There's no doubt that he was fasting. Some other questions. Is it possible? Is it possible the disciples would not think anything unusual about Yahusha fasting again, as they would have observed him fasting many times throughout his ministry? And if so, then, more questions and comments. The Last Supper was very likely a celebration of finishing their practicum with their master. They just didn't know it. In that case, the Last Supper definitely was not the Passover meal, and it did not take place on Abib 14. Passover is a festival, but it does not begin the evening before dawn of Abib 14. This is the traditional teaching, not based in Torah.
Synoptic Gospels can be reconciled with John. That's what we've seen. Therefore, when the topic of this study is approached with an open mind and the belief that the scriptures cannot be broken, as John 10:35 states, then we can reconcile all of these accounts. John 10:35, the scripture cannot be broken.
And as we close up with an epilogue, the Last Supper celebration on Abib 13 really was the last time the disciples were together with Yahusha before he died. It is highly unlikely that any of the disciples ate a Passover meal during the evening of Abib 14 under these surprising circumstances, which they were not expecting. However, there is something they did do, and that was they locked themselves behind barred doors for fear of the Jews. In fact, they were still there by the evening of the first day of the week, which was Wave Sheaf, and that's noted by John. In John 20, verse 19, then the same day at evening, being the first of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Then came Yahusha, and he stood in the midst, and saith unto them, Peace be unto you. Even though they missed the Passover meal on this Abib 14, do you think they would have celebrated Passover in the second month? Just a question. Because Torah does provide that option if the first Passover is missed, with very specific instructions. Would the disciples qualify to eat the Passover in the second month? And so with that, we finish our third witness review for this day and date. And here's the final answer. The Last Supper was special, and it could have followed the tradition of a celebration meal with their master. And what was that day? It was the third cycle of the week. It was a Tuesday. Therefore, this banquet would not have been a Passover meal on Wednesday of Abib 14. And the date, absolutely, it was Abib 13 as our third witness.
Here is 60 AD. Paul's instructions on the Last Supper and the new Passover ordinances. We read this in 1 Corinthians 11, 23 to 26. He writes, For I have received of Yahusha that which also I delivered unto you, that Yahusha, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup, which he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye, as oft as ye drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, ye do show Yahusha's death till he come. Note here, Luke 22, 15 to 16 mentions, Yahusha will not eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom. That will be the final fulfillment of Passover. The wedding supper is next, a celebratory meal for the everlasting covenant. Will you be there? Questions and comments can be sent to Covenant Calendar team leaders at questions@studythecalendar.com and www.studythecalendar.com. We thank you for your time, and we wish you shalom from our Creator. Thank you again.
Thank you, Tim. Kim.
Thank you,
Thank
all three
you.
of you.
Thank you for allowing us the time to share, Maria.
Great, very important presentation slideshow. Do you have time for just a few questions, easy questions?
Mhm.
Okay, great. Can you please give me synoptically the times in Roman reckoning, like the day starts at midnight, this kind of times, when he was put up on the pale or cross or tree, the time that he left his last breath out and he said, it is finished, and the time that they took his body down from the cross, off the cross. So these 3 times. Can I have them, please, again?
Want that in Roman reckoning?
Yes.
Yeah, like the time we use today. Yes.
So, okay, I haven't been asked that one.
Well, you wanted to start, where did you wanted to start when he was before Pilate?
Okay, let's start there.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Even if you give me
Yeah.
just when he was put on the cross, I would understand that it would be,
Yeah. Yeah.
When he was put on the cross, that would be 6 more hours. That would be the 9 hours from midnight.
So 9 a.m. in the morning, our time.
Yeah.
That's what. So
Yeah.
he would be with Pilate at 6 a.m., like very early
Approximately.
in the day. That would be the first thing. Okay,
Yes.
So 9 o'clock he's on the cross, and then what time he dies?
At noon.
No,
Oh.
at noon is when the sun was darkened.
Oh, sorry, I missed the question there. I was expecting the next event. Yeah, but at noon is when it was darkened, and then it went, and then at the third, no, at the I'm mixed up here. At noon is when it went dark at the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m. Roman reckoning. That's what it is today. At 3 in the afternoon, that's when he died.
3 p.m. Okay.
And and
then after sunset, they requested his body, which was
Yes.
on the cross still.
Yes.
It was on the tree, yes.
Yes.
On the tree, yeah.
Yeah, his body was not requested for until after the sun had set, and there is many witnesses to that in the gospel accounts.
Yeah, I really like Mark's account of this. It's one of the very best. They're all good. They all have pieces of the puzzle. But in Mark, it says, when evening had come. Now, we pointed out Mark 1:32 is really important. Mark 1:32 says, at sunset, at even, when the day, oh, no, I got to read it. I have to read it because it's very interesting the way he words it. He
I'll read
says, go ahead then, Tim, if you've got it.
And when evening came, when the sun was down, they brought to him all who were sick and those who were demon possessed.
Now that verse is really important for a couple of things, but Mark is the one that explains right in the first chapter how to understand his word of evening. Okay, so when he says evening, that means the sun has set, because a lot of the Jewish terminology, they have 2 evenings. It's another whole big study between the evenings. And they put some of their evenings in the afternoon from 3 to 5 o'clock. We won't go into that. But Mark has told you how to understand his word evening. So when he says in Mark 15:42, and when evening had come, then we know the sun has set, because it was still the preparation day, that is the day before the Shabbat. Then verse 32 says, Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate. He had to go to Pilate's hall, get an audience with Pilate, probably had to wait, and asked for the body of Yahusha. And then when you drop down to verse 46, after he had that permission from Pilate to have the body, to prepare it, then he went and bought linen. This is way after sunset. And we were raised to believe that Yahusha was buried before sunset, because sunset brings in the Shabbat. But it's impossible when you look at just the verses in Mark. You don't even have to use Matthew, Luke, and John. Just Mark will tell you that. So in the morning, at dawn, was when he was standing before Pilate. At the 3rd hour, or 9 o'clock in the morning, he was placed as a sacrifice on the tree. At high noon, it became dark for 3 hours, and he gave up his spirit at 3 o'clock in the afternoon Roman time. Then there was quite a bit of activity before Joseph could get to Pilate, and Joseph asked Pilate after sunset in the evening for the body. And of course, then all night long they were preparing the body. And as Luke tells us, it was just as the Epiphosko was dawning, just as the light was drawing on for the Shabbat, which would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread, coming that next day, is when they closed up the tomb. So when we read everything in order.
Okay, great, I understand. I've heard many people saying that the disciples kept sacrificing even after the resurrection of Yahusha, and that throughout the Gospels, not only the Gospels, also the letters and everything, they insinuate, or there are mentions that they kept sacrificing. So is that correct, or they understand something wrong, or they
Well, the
What
problem
was going
word
on?
is disciples. Their sacrificing did go on all the way up to 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed. Yes, there were sacrifices that happened, but his leaders, his followers would not have been sacrificing. They would have understood that he was the final sacrifice. But there were others that were sacrificing because remember, the leaders of the community, the Jewish leaders, did not accept him as the Messiah. They were still waiting for a Messiah, so they continued sacrificing.
I don't remember where or to whom that was instructed, but either Peter or Paul maybe. So he came back from one of his trips to Jerusalem, and he met with the other
Mm.
disciples, and they confront him and tell him, what is that we're hearing about you, that you're not keeping the law, and go now to the temple and take the Greek with you and sacrifice for him, pay for his tithing. And Paul did that, and they used that situation to say, you see, everybody was kept sacrificing and going to the temple and do everything that they used to do even before Yahushua.
That was a that was not a sacrifice that you would normally see for the Passover, for every day, for the festivals and whatnot. That was a Nazirite vow. Okay, Paul didn't want to. He didn't want to partake of it, but he kind of got put into a corner. They said, well, if you don't do this, it's going to look like you're not clean. Like you've been around Gentiles for a long time now, years. And so, to save face in the community there in Jerusalem with Jews and the leaders, they wanted him to do this. So he did enter in to the last part of that vow with those other gentlemen. He did, and he paid for the sacrifices, even though he did not want to. But he gave in to their demands so that he could be a witness there. Was it a mistake? It's a little different of a situation. I think that they still probably continued sacrifices of Thanksgiving and whatnot. I think personally for myself, they had been used to sacrificing for thousands of years.
Maybe they just stopped the Passover lamb and kept the rest.
I don't believe that any of Yahushua's followers would have ever sacrificed again. A sacrifice that would be pointing towards his death. Okay. So any comments from Tim and Kim, because these sacrifices that they did for the Nazirite vow were very different. They're not the same as sacrifices that pointed towards the Messiah as a type, as an anti-type and an antitype.
I think that, yes, they were doing not his direct followers that were with him, but the others that did not have enough understanding. They probably did do the sacrifices because they did not understand the depth of meaning behind it. They might not have understood the prophecy by Daniel 9 there when it says that all these sacrifices and oblations were to cease. Bang, period, right there. That might not have been understood. And that might have taken a while. We recognize that there's a space of time where people understand things, to a time of reckoning, if you will. Yahushua's brother, who was on the lunar calendar, doubted him. And when it comes to Yaakov 1:17, Yaakov, or James as we understand in English, he recognized the calendar, the Tukufa, or the shadow-based calendar, in which there is no arcing of the shadow, a straight line shadow. That's written in Genesis 1:17. So he had a time frame where he understood what happened at Passover. He recognized that Yahushua was keeping the law, that was fulfilling the Torah. And he, in his time frame, adjusted his thinking in accordance with the Torah, and he recognized that Yahuwah does not change. This calendar is correct right from the beginning. And so what I'm trying to show is that there is a a space of time where a person brings things to understanding and does Shema, a corrective understanding. Listen and act accordingly.
Mhm.
And that might take some time. I know I have trouble with that. You read, you understand something, and you realize, okay, I have an adjustment in my life that
Mhm.
I need to do.
It's
Sometimes it happens like that,
yeah.
sometimes not.
You know, even just with the difference in the day start between sunset and day dawn, when we teach the proper day start is dawn, our sunset followers, some of them switch over the next week. They just start their Shabbat at dawn, and there's others that need some time to figure it out. You know, they'll do Friday night sunset all the way to Sunday morning dawn just to be sure, and some need weeks, months, you know, to make that transition because it's just like so different. And so I think we can afford that those at Jerusalem during that time needed to have a transition time to just figure this out. And also remember that not everybody understood who the Messiah was on the tree that day. Not everybody, they thought he was a criminal. He was crucified on the day before the Passover festival of the Jews. So a lot of people didn't know he was the Messiah, you know,
They expected he was just another criminal.
another criminal.
They had no idea.
And
it
are
would
there
take
different
time to understand that. Go ahead, Kim. Sorry.
offerings? We say sacrifice, but offerings.
Mhm.
So there are offerings for sin, there are offerings for thanksgiving, there are, there's, I'm not
Thank
going to,
offerings.
huh?
Thank offerings.
Mhm.
Yeah, offerings.
Mhm.
Okay. And at some point you mentioned red kefir or kefir?
Heifer.
Kefir. What is that? I don't recall what's
Love
that.
it. Love it. Good question. The red heifer had
Heifer.
yeah, it's a young cow.
Ah,
Yeah.
Okay, heifer is a young cow that hasn't had a child yet or hasn't had a calf yet. The heifer had to be sacrificed in a ultra most specific way. And that dust that was collected from that red heifer, a portion was put into water and it was used for people to cleanse away sin. And that dust from the red heifer, oh boy, we got 2 studies on this. It's great. That dust from the red heifer, it had to be placed in a clean vial that was not ever used before. It had to be placed in a very specific, cared for vial. And I'm just going over this very, very briefly. That statute, Yahusha had to fulfill. He had to be placed in an absolutely clean tomb that no other person had been in that tomb before. That relates directly back to the red heifer. The most specific thing about that red heifer is the Ola worm. That there is a crimson ingredient that had to be burned with that red heifer, a crimson ingredient from the Tola worm, very specific. Yahusha likened himself to a worm, not a worm like an earthworm in the ground. It was specific, that Tola worm. He likened himself to that. Why? Because when that worm lives and bears children, young Tola worms, it it attaches onto a tree. Note the tree. When it bears its children, it dies. And in that death, it stains the tree crimson red.
ah,
And in 3 days, its body goes pure white as snow. The children, the young, I should say, the offspring, not children, the offspring of this Tola worm eat the body of the mother to live. And in that process, in 3 days, note the 3 days, its body turns white as snow. When you look at this very, very carefully, it's a picture of Yahusha, clear as a bell. This crimson thread, if you will, goes all through the scripture right to the body of Yahusha. That red heifer had to be sacrificed outside of the walls, away from the encampment, exactly as Yahusha was crucified, outside the walls of Yahusha. This is a statute. Yahusha had to fulfill that. In Jericho, when the harlot, when her life was saved, it was a scarlet rope from her window that was recognized, that saved her family's life. Okay, that crimson thread runs deep.
Mm-hmm.
The crimson is a color of the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
It's just it's the linkage in there in this is absolutely fascinating when you go through it. And we have studies for you if you want to look at that privately.
Thanks. And 2 more questions and I'm done. So I hear you saying that the Gospels most probably were translated from Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a question that I had, because when I'm reading in Greek, I wonder, am I reading the original or am I reading a translation? And everybody that I've asked about this, everywhere I've looked online and encyclopedias and scholars, everybody says that the original language is Greek, not Hebrew. So I'm confused, and I would really like not to be confused. I would really like to know if the Greek is a translation or if it's the actual original language that they wrote.
I have a copy of the Evan Bohan edition of Matthew, and it is Hebrew. And that's
Okay.
easy. Just download that. That's no problem. I've never been able to get a Hebrew copy of the New Testament other than what has been translated from the Greek back into Hebrew, and I don't accept
So
that.
why would they do that if there are in original language, if they have the original language in Hebrew?
I don't understand why that is done, but I do not know where to get the original Hebrew in the New Testament. I don't
But
know.
why would scholars say that the original is in Greek? Because like
Because
97% of them say it's in Greek, not in Hebrew.
I don't know why they say it's in Greek, because there's other scholars that study the structure
Mm-hmm.
of how things are spoken in Greek, and they say it has a Hebrew format put into Greek. And they say it's structured from a very Hebrew base, but translated into Greek. And this is as far as I understand it. I do not have paper in my hand or downloaded of a original Hebrew New Testament. I don't have that.
But we can remember too that even when Yahusha died, there is Hebrew where it says my Yah. How does it say it in Hebrew, Tim?
Ma'el. Oh,
Ma'el.
Ma'el. Eli sabachthani.
Yeah, that's Hebrew, right? And then
Aramaic, that's Aramaic, not
That's
Hebrew.
Aramaic.
well,
Yeah.
Aramaic is just kind of a cousin. It's kind of the everyday language of the Hebrew, is the way that I understand it. And also, when he raised the little girl from the dead, there are portions in the Gospels that actually use the Hebrew. When he was reading from Isaiah, that would have been a Hebrew manuscript. There's many that feel that his followers did understand Hebrew. They would have spoken Hebrew, but Greek was the main language of the day. That was the language that they were communicating in. In fact, lots of the common people had lost their language. They didn't speak in it anymore. So Greek was used to get the message out, but the writers, especially Paul, would have written in Hebrew. I don't see even the letter to the Hebrews, the book in our New Testament called Hebrews. I don't see how they would have written it in Greek. They might have written both. We don't know, but those copies seem to be lost.
So since we don't have any copy, it's just a conjecture that we make that it must have been originally in Hebrew, because we don't have any actual, manuscript or something. Not even a fragment of a manuscript that we could point to that and say, hey, this is the original.
Except for the book of Matthew. There is a book of Matthew that is in Hebrew that Tim has.
Okay.
So that's a good indication there.
That's another witness to the even being after sunset, the Matthew, the Evan Bohan edition, because when you read even there in Matthew, it's Erev, and that is the mixture.
Yeah. Okay, and lastly, I will just mention that it's not exactly a question, but apart from Luke, Matthew and Mark, the way it's written in the Greek, it's very difficult to say that what they meant to say is that the first day, the first of unleavened bread is approaching. It's very, very difficult for me, as I'm reading in Greek, to make that leap. For Luke is a bit easier because he's using the word ilthe, which means it came. And still today in Greek, we can say that ilthe to Pascha, Pesach came, and we mean that it's approaching. So for Luke, I can make that leap. With the other two, I can't, because the way it's written, it's very on that day, on the first day of unleavened bread. It's no capital anywhere on the Greek text. On the day of on the first of unleavened bread, when we slaughter the lamb. So I'm saying that not to question that it could have been the 14th, because I'm absolutely certain and absolutely convinced for all four accounts after the supper that it was the 13th and not the 14th. I'm just saying that I as a Greek reading Greek, I don't know why they would phrase it like that, since we know and they knew it wasn't the 14th. I'm just saying it. It's out there. Oh.
It's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
And that's another reason why John is so important. We're just finding that the book of John is the one that usually answers the questions. He solves the riddle. And for this teaching, for the teaching of, even unleavened bread, I've seen others where they want to make it the Passover meal. But you know what? They will not go through the John verses. They don't even touch the book of John.
No, they don't. He's never mentioned.
Yeah.
And you can, I don't know if you ever redo your first slides. You can absolutely say that on any Greek manuscript, because I have many, there's no capital letter anywhere. No mention of a feast. No Matthew, Mark, Luke, nowhere. All three of them, small letters, first of unleavened. Πρώτη των αζήμων. That's it. That's it. That's all they say.
So the modern versions, like we just mentioned, a couple, but when I started looking at the modern versions, they all have the capital letters.
Yeah, but they're translated
Yes.
they translating from the Greek, and the Greek do not have
Yeah.
capital. So they're inserting this on purpose on the
Yes.
English
On
translations.
purpose. Exactly.
Why on purpose?
I don't know.
Because
Yeah.
if we accept their capitals and we understand we accept
It's even more
understand
it's even more confusing when they capitalize. I mean, it is confusing without the capitals. They make it even more confusing
Yes.
with the
Yes.
capitals, because now they wanna they want us to believe that it's the High Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they,
Mm-hmm.
which is even more absurd with what's happening afterwards.
unless you observe sunset to sunset, then it's okay, because
Mhm.
then you forget about the
Mhm.
statutes of the Passover being on the 14th, and you have the Passover lamb being slain on the Bib 15. That fits right in with sunset system of determining the day. Is it confusing? Absolutely.
Say that again, Tim, please. So if
When you have the
okay,
capital letters and it
yes,
points to you slay the Passover lamb on Abib 15 on the first day of 11 bread festival,
yes,
that fits right into sunset theory, where they start the or they slay the lamb at the evening of the 14th and then go right on into the Sabbath in the night season Sabbath of the 15th. It fits right in with the sunset system of a determining time. Does it confuse and slay the statutes? Yes, you can't. The statutes are destroyed, but it supports their sunset system.
Mhm. Mhm.
So according to that logic, if we say that when the disciples asked Yahusha, where do you want us to prepare the Passover? And that day was the High Shabbat. I don't think I understand. Or they're saying that the first day of the unleavened bread is the Passover, is the 14th.
They're bringing the two feasts together.
Okay, so it's a big feast of unleavened bread, starting with Passover and then another 7 days.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's
Okay, so
it's very confusing. But once you've gone through all the charts on how this works, how this confusion works, that's when you'll understand it clearer. It's disregarding the statutes. That's what it's doing, and it's bringing the slaying of the Passover lamb onto Abib 15 in sunset.
okay, so according to that logic, then the Jews, the Pharisees, would have Yahusha on the cross on a high Shabbat.
No,
No.
no, no. It works
No.
like this, Maria. If it's their Passover day, okay, that they slay the Passover sacrifice, but the command is to eat the sacrifice after the sun has set. Okay, so you
On
have
the 15th.
the day. Let's just say they slay it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That was their tradition.
Yeah.
But they're not going to be eating it until after sunset. At sunset is where their unleavened bread Shabbat comes in.
The 15th.
Yes.
And that's the high Shabbat.
Yes.
And they eat it along with Yehusha. That's the Last Supper, according to them.
Yeah.
That on the 15th, that has just started, sunset.
Yeah.
During the night, the 15th, that has just started, he's arrested. That morning, which is still the 15th, High Shabbat, he's been put on the cross.
Their Passover didn't start until the evening, when Yahusha had already died. They do not regard Yahusha as anything. Their Passover started at sunset, and Yahusha wasn't even in the picture. He was nothing.
He was dead.
Yes.
He was
And then
dead,
it couldn't have been, then the Last Supper couldn't have been on the High Shabbat. First we have the High Shabbat, and then the next day we have
It doesn't
No,
work.
Tim, I think it's what you just said. It's completely.
It's
It doesn't work.
seriously confusing.
It doesn't
is.
work. It's Saturday. First, it's Saturday or High Shabbat. I'm sorry, it's a High Shabbat. Then nothing. Then it's a blank, and then we have a Passover, and then we go back to High Shabbat. It doesn't make sense.
None at all. None at all.
No.
And this is the problem that we faced when we started doing these charts, is trying to take mass confusion, make sense out of it so that we can show it's mass confusion. That was the challenge. And our heads got turned around big time trying to do this so that it made sense. Now, what will make sense to you, what you're going to see in after two presentations, when we come to the crucifixion year, the second presentation is going to go through the scriptures step by step, 12 hours at a time, according to exactly what is written. And you're going to see this very, very clear as a bell. Who believed what, why, what actions were taken, and when, and on what date. You're going to see this clear.
Okay.
But right now, it's like a great big dark mud puddle.
I wanna try to figure out why Matthew and Mark use that grammar or syntax or these words when clearly they mean something else. I'm going to try to do some research. If I come up with something else, I'll let you know.
We'll be interested to see that. Yeah, very interesting.
Okay. That's it was a big presentation, but it was easy to follow. I mean, it was easily understood. No complex meanings in there. Important, a very, very important one. I wish, I hope people will watching and rewatch it.
So
Yeah.
Maria, you said that you watched the presentation on the leavened and unleavened bread for the Last Supper, because that's a big question as well. And in a way, I like to teach that one first and then teach this one second. You can interchange them. Do you feel that the information that you saw in that other presentation would have been helpful to have before this one?
No.
Oh, okay.
Just a mention that the type and the antitype, just a mention, I think it was more than enough for people and me to understand this presentation about the Last Supper.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So
it's an extra like an extra tool you can have on your bag with tools, but it wasn't necessary for my understanding today.
Okay, because the bread presentation shows you that you cannot go with just the Greek definitions. You've got to take it back to the Hebrew to understand what's going on with that bread. And so personally, the Greek for me, I'm not going to speak for myself, is harder to work with than the Hebrew definitions. Because, and a perfect example is this word even in Mark 1:32. Now, Mark was the scribe, I believe, for Peter. And Peter and John were very, very close to one another. But in Mark 1:32, the word that is in the Greek, and I have to always keep a little note here in my Bible.
Mark 1?
Mark 1:32. There's two different words for evening. But the evening that they use,
Οψίας.
Is that the one in Mark 1:32?
Οψίας διγενόμενος ότε έδει ο ήλιος. That's the sunset.
Yeah. Just a second here. This is another whole different study.
Οψίας is the word that you're looking for. Mark 32.
That is sunset?
Yeah, the first definition is afternoon. The first definition is afternoon, and then it will have a definition for evening. If they would have used the word hespera.
Espera is after sunset. It's that twilight.
Yes. See that
when the star, when that star is visible on the sky with the moon usually.
So because Opsius was used, it's really good that Mark wrote at evening when the sun had set, because Opsius does not have the first definition for evening. It has afternoon, because some understand afternoon as part of an evening as well. That's where that between the evening stuff comes in. So if they would have used Hespera, then Mark wouldn't have had to say, he wouldn't have had to say at evening when the sun had set. They would have just known.
Opsias is not a word that we're using for indicating a time of the day so much. Opsimos is something that is ripe, something that is done. It has completed its purpose. Opsimos, like even your age. You're in an Opsias age. You know, you have you have lived your you're past your prime, let's say. So that's what it means. That's why I'm saying, even if he didn't continue to say after the sunset, reading Opsias, I would understand that the day was ripe. The day was, finished its purpose.
But you see, in English, it's not like that. When people look up Opsias and they see the first definition is afternoon, and it's because between the evenings lots of times has this understanding of between 3 and 5 o'clock, or 3 and 6 o'clock, or there's all kinds of things that happen with that phrase, between the evenings. So in English, it's understood different.
Still, he continues saying after the sunset.
Yes.
So
yes,
it's explicitly
I
clear.
like to call it a qualifier. He qualifies exactly when this is. This is not the evening just before sunset, like around 5 or 5:30 or even 3 o'clock. This is after the sun has set. So Mark has defined how the word evening is to be used in his book, and he uses this word 6 times. So he has set out the rules right there in Mark 1:32. Now, the interesting thing is that when you actually read the context around Mark 1:32, it actually supports sunset, because he's talking about miracles of Yahusha, and Yahusha is healing after the sun has set, and he doesn't get into any trouble whatsoever, okay, because the Sabbath has been finished according to the Jewish understanding. But we know in other miracles, when he healed on the Sabbath day, they were ready to stone him. So Mark 1:32 is a really important verse. And not only that, Matthew and Luke also follow the same pattern. They follow the same pattern with their use of evening. Now, John is pretty careful. He stays away from that word. That's an interesting thing. He stays away from that word. So
which word he's using, John, you remember? Or where? I
don't, for the English, I believe evening, he doesn't really use it. He stays away from it because he must have realized there was a problem there. That's all I can figure out.
I see. It shows he uses it in John 20, maybe?
I could be, it's been so long.
Okay.
Maybe around the Last Supper and that event for the word evening. It seems to me that John doesn't really use it, but he's
the same as Mark. Opsias τη ημέρα εκείνη.
In 19, John 20:19.
19, yes.
Yes, and John 6:16. So 2019. That has nothing to do with the Last Supper, though.
6, John 6:16, you said.
Yeah, I think it's, I've got here John 6:16. This is for Opsias.
Yeah. Opsia.
Yeah.
On John 20, verse 19 uses Opsias also.
Yes.
Opsia, yeah. Both on 6:16 and 20.
Yes,
19.
but he does not use it for the events around the Last Supper, because 2019 is already, way after the tomb, the empty tomb. 2019, what does it say? Then the same day at evening. This is the first day. This is wave sheaf offering day. Okay. So I found that really interesting.
They have a problem in English to translate the word opsia because they're not sure if it's 5 to 7 or 7 to 9 or which time window.
It's because of the phrase evening. Because I mean the phrase between the evenings, because oh my goodness, there's sacrifices between the evenings. They want to have that sacrifice at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And so some say the evening starts when the sun begins to go down at noon. That's where it's going past the meridian, PM. But the evening sacrifice was to be after the sun was set in the Arev. So they use the phrase between the evenings so that they can have a 3 p.m. sacrifice, which is midway between noon and sunset. But that's not the correct use of that phrase either. So because they use between the evenings and they say 3 o'clock in the afternoon is between these two places, then when you get to evening, lots of them say, well, evening could be 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. Some say it's 3 to 5. Some say 5 to 6. There's all kinds of things out there.
They have 2 evenings.
2 evenings. They have 2 evenings before the sunset. They have 2 evenings after the sunset. And guess what? It's all because of the sunset day start. And they want those sacrifices. They want both sacrifices on the same day. So they moved it from morning Boker to 9 o'clock and from Erev, dusk, to 3 o'clock. So they could be both on the same day. Why? Because when the sun sets, it changes the day. So it doesn't work.
The moon.
Mm-hmm.
The sunset causes a lot of problems. Sunset day.
Yeah. Complicates things. If Matt were here with his very English accent, he would say rubbish.
Absolutely.
Rubbish. That's all rubbish.
It is.
I can't do it, but he's excellent at it. Okay.
That's a lot to digest. Yes.
Yeah. I'm starting to understand why sunset is starting the day at sunset is so important to some people. They hold on to it. It will force a collapse on many things people are trying to avoid.
Now the Zadok calendar, most of them do morning, they do sunrise, which isn't quite right. It's closer, not quite right, but it doesn't, even the morning sunrise day start would not cause these problems. It's the sunset, and there is a lot of sunset. So that Mark 132 shows you right there that those Pharisees, those Jews, whoever they were honoring a sunset day.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to tell you that there are many people that who follow the Zadok calendar that they still start the day on sunset.
Yeah.
Because apparently neither Enoch nor Zadok, the Dead Sea Scrolls, are specific to when they start.
Okay.
It's kind of open. So you can follow a Zadok calendar and you can start your day either on sunset or sunrise. It's fine. Nobody cares.
Who it does.
Sunset we all brothers here.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work in the Gospels. And if you want to have unity in a group, you'll have to disagree on calendars, because sunset will not work.
No, I'm starting to understand that. Okay, perfect.